Okay, we're in chapter 6 and verse 4 of the Canticle of Canticles, or Song of Songs. Depends on what your Bible calls it. Also calls it the Song of Solomon. So, this is the man speaking. He begins speaking here again. He says, "You are fair as Tisra, my love, enchanting as Jerusalem." In Israel, at the time of the breakup, there was a north and a south kingdom. The south kingdom is called Judah, the capital Jerusalem. The north is called Israel, and the capital was Samaria. But the earliest capital there was Tisra. And this Tisra, the word could be used here because it means beautiful. The name of the city was beautiful. But it could also be used here because of the date of the passage, that indicating the passage was written at a very early period. Okay. Now, I think I told you way at the beginning that this book is a compilation of Bedouin wedding songs. And so they put them together to kind of make a story. So it could be from very, very early. But anyway, Tisra actually means beautiful. So they take the capital of the southern kingdom and the capital of the northern kingdom, Tisra and Jerusalem. He says, "Turn your eyes away from me. They overwhelm me." And one of the things I think is really interesting, oftentimes, I don't know how to say that. I think I'll tell you, maybe it could be more explained in a story. One of my professors who had been, he was in Bavaria and obviously drafted into the war and everything. And when the thing was over, he had been, what do you call it, drafted all seminarians. And so he went to Africa as a missionary, became a priest, went to Africa as a missionary, eventually came to San Diego as a moral teacher. But anyway, when he was in Africa, he was sent to this village where nobody wore anything ever. They came to mass stark naked and this sort of thing. And they said the thing that was funny about it was that if you looked at a woman in a certain way, they would kill you right then and there. And he said that as he began to think of that, when he was back in Bavaria, you know, the way people would dress and everything, it wasn't the dressing that was the issue. That people really communicate. If you study in psychology, there is what is called the copulatory gaze. And the copulatory gaze is a way a man looks at a woman or a woman looks at a man. Now, I think women are more aware of this because it happens to them all the time. It's very rare, you know, that someone looks at a male with a copulatory gaze. But it's a way of communicating this kind of interest in another person. But it's really your eyes. If you're not, you know, if you're not speaking, you're not writing or anything. And where you notice this a lot is in the Mideast, where sometimes the only thing you can see, the eyes are very, very expressive. I remember I was in a jewelry shop with, I just happened to be in there when an Arab came in, and the Arabs, under the Quran, if you have more than one wife, you have to take them all with you when you go, so you can't treat them differently. So he was getting jewelry, which meant he had to get each one a piece of jewelry. It was very interesting because none of the women spoke. They would stand there and then they would look, and he would know the piece of jewelry they're looking at and their approval or disapproval or this, and the whole thing was all with eyes, all with eyes. And there's just an awful lot of communication that takes place with the eyes. That's one of the reasons I think that people who go blind have such an increase in their other sensory areas. It's because we are so sight dependent. It's just we are remarkably sight dependent. So he says, turn your eyes away from me, because basically her eyes are seducing him. He says, your hair is like a flock of goats surging down the slopes of Mount Gilead. And the goats normally there are black. And if you ever go to the Bedouin camps, you'll notice the tents are black. And the goat hair is very curly and very stiff. So the material they weave out of the goat hair is actually waterproof. And so they'll weave it and they put that on top of their tent, okay? But so they use this thing of the way it flows. And I don't know if you've ever seen movies of the goats that move down the hill, but they flow like a river as they go down, and that's what he's talking about. I do like to point out, though, comparing a woman's hair to a flock of goats is not an appropriate thing in our society. Having said that, it says, your teeth, a flock of shorn sheep coming up from the washing. And they would, sheep were raised there for a lot of things, but when you're going to sell sheep, you bathe them, okay, you wash them. And they would do it in, first of all, their troughs they're about shoulder high for a sheep. You have the sheep stand in there a while, and the ticks have to leave, you know. And they're literally covered with ticks, because in the deep hair they get in there. But anyway, then the ticks are all, you know, washed off and stuff, and then the hair is beautiful and they're white and that sort of thing. And this is most particularly in Jerusalem, because there in the washing of sheep, they'd oftentimes be washing sheep for sacrifice. So they were to look good and everything, you know. It's sort of like a 4-H project, actually, that you have. You could tell at a 4-H project that none of those animals knew anything about the wild, you know. Anyway, it says, each one has its twin, not one unpaired with another. And I think you know that the teeth are created to meet, as far, and the things like an overbite, or that all indicates something's wrong. So they're seeing everything is perfect about this woman. Your cheeks behind your veil are halves of a pomegranate. And so the idea that the veil's on, but he can see her cheeks, you know, through the veil. It's just an elaborate description. There are 60 queens and 80 concubines and countless girls. My dove is only one, perfect and mine. Now, I've told you that in constructing this, they construct it sometimes as though the king who has the harem in which this girl is Solomon. And then sometimes the young man is actually Solomon. But they put these different poems together. In Solomon's court, there were 60 queens. I think if you read the scriptures, you find out how often Solomon was married. But one of the things, I think he had 400 wives at one point. But one of the things that went on at that time, the way you created a treaty with another country was a member of your family married a member of his family. So essentially, you had a family member who was a prisoner in the other country. And that's how it was worked. Solomon, if you ever go to Israel today, the mount where the big Hadassah hospital is Mount Scopus. And Mount Scopus was covered with the homes of Solomon's wives, his queens. They didn't live with him, okay? That's the way that was done. Concubines were more likely the household people who took care of the king. In the ancient world, a king was normally taken care of by women, because they thought, you know, the guy could defend himself against the women. And the only men that were involved in there would be, what do they call it, eunuchs. So, in order to protect them. So, he says that there are all these women, and you can imagine they're beautiful women who've been selected to be, you know, in the court and everything. You can imagine they're dressed magnificent, but he can pick out the one and that's true of everyone, you know. That I think it's interesting that in college when we would go to parties, particularly people who were dating, if you watched a young guy come in, his eyes would not stop till he found his girlfriend there, or she came in, her eyes wouldn't stop. And one of the things that most amazed me, that you could be in a conversation with them, there's a lot of noise in the room, they would hear instantly when their partner spoke somewhere. It's just this thing. And so he sees her. She is the darling of her mother, the favorite of the one who bore her. And right now, he's saying that, you know, she was the perfect one, the mother. But I want you to know that that's, again, an allusion to Solomon. One of the things about Solomon's mother was Bathsheba. And Bathsheba was very, very attuned to the importance of Solomon. And Solomon was not the next in line for the throne. The next in the line for the throne was Absalom, which was one of the oldest of David's sons. And so he's in line for the throne. But Bathsheba made Solomon the favorite of David and worked it over a period of time so that he became very, very important to David over all the others. And he was the favorite of the one who bore her, Solomon was. Girls have seen her and proclaim her blessed. Queens and concubines have sung her praises. And he's again going that she's select among all these. He recognized her, but even they recognize her as beautiful. And again, that's a projection of his view of her. He says, who is this coming like the dawn, fair as the moon, bright as the sun, formidable as an army with banners? And again, this is not a description we would ordinarily use for a woman, but the idea is you cannot miss her. You cannot not see her. He says, I went down to the nut orchard to see the fresh shoots in the valley, to see if the vines were budding and the pomegranate trees in flower. What they're talking about there are the beginnings of spring. And I think you know spring is considered the season of love. With regards, that's when the animals mate and all this sort of thing. So what he's doing is checking, is this the time for us to be together? Okay, so he's looking at all these different things. He says, I do not know my own soul. It has set me among the chariots of Aminadab. Aminadab was a great general in Israel, and he ultimately will be the main, he was the main general, rather, of David. And so this was a very important man and everything. But he's saying, I don't know what's special about me, but has put me in this place with regards to her. And one of the amazing things, one of the most powerful things about the love experience is that it allows a person to come to realize who they are, that you're really important, but nobody's important to everybody. You are really, really important in someone's eyes, and that's transforming. And I think of it in that song that I forget years ago about the he looks upon me with the eyes of love. The eyes of love are upon me, and it really changes you. It changes the way you act. It changes the way you are. It allows you to come to a knowledge of who you are. And ultimately, if you read someone like Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross, they say when that happens to you, you have seen God viewing you through the other person. And too often, you know, you look like if I were to take an individual person in college, let's take a young man. It doesn't matter if everyone in the college thinks he's great. Doesn't matter if all the teachers think he's a good student. It doesn't matter if all the people think he's a great athlete. All of that is insignificant beside the one young lady who would want him. And that's what transforms him. But that's the essence of this love relationship. And that's why, you know, that I think sometimes this is becoming very interesting in our society. I think in gay relationships and stuff like that. You have to realize that someone in a gay relationship can only realize that from someone of the same gender. That's just the way it, but that's, I think and I'm not saying anything about their sexual contact or anything, because I think oftentimes this takes place long before there's any sexual contact with the individual. But this idea of allowing, basically to allow God to view you through the eyes of another human being, because you'll never get that anywhere else. And then you come to the knowledge of who you are. So now the chorus, this group of women called the Daughters of Jerusalem, but they're the chorus. They say, come back, girl from Shulam. And this place refers to, Shulam was an area, actually it's in Persia, but Shulam produced the most magnificent dancers, like the dancers that were in the courts and the different, they namely came from this area, a great training of dancers. So, girl from Shulam, come back, let us look at you. And then they sing the response. Why are you looking at the girl from Shulam, dancing between two lines of dancers? Now, this, to understand in the Mideast, dancing, public dancing with people is done only by men. Like you see, men have these two lines of dancers and this sort of thing. A woman always dances alone. And for them, a dancer would almost be the equivalent of a prostitute in our society, because the way their women are bound up, the idea that a woman would dance publicly and stuff was seen as very, very disreputable. And so what they're saying is that she's as beautiful as the dancers produced here, and as dancing between the two lines of men, that she's dancing in those two lines of men. Okay? And now he goes on again. He says, how beautiful are your feet in sandals, O prince's daughter. The curve of your thighs is like jewels, the work of a master hand. And he's going through a very strongly physical description of her that I think is very different from our background anyway. The curve of your thighs is like jewels. When we look at jewelry today, I think the thing that makes jewelry beautiful is what's called faceting, which are these planes on a stone. And I think, you know, like today, that's all done by computers. But historically, faceting did not come in for a very long period. Faceting didn't come in until they learned how to cut and polish and everything. But the ancient world, the way they would take stones was basically tumble them. And they would tumble them until they, you know, were really beautiful and everything. So they are curved and this sort of thing. And probably the best example of this kind of stuff is if you go into the Vatican museums. The Vatican museums, they have the jewelry and the crosses and everything that have been used by the popes for 1,500 years. So, I mean, you see them, and what they would do would be do them, you know, on the tumbler, and then they would adjust the setting to that, but they didn't adjust stones to settings. It was very different, okay? And the work of a master. Your navel is like a bowl well-rounded with no lack of wine. Now, I hope that doesn't mean she's a drunk, but the idea here of you know, I forget what they said that a woman's stomach is said to be shaped like a persimmon. I don't know where they get that, but anyway, this is the thing. So the well-rounded, Your belly, a heap of wheat surrounded with lilies. Your breasts are two fawns, twins of a gazelle, okay? And notice they did that with the teeth, the eyes, everything. Anytime it's paired, they have to be exactly the same, this sort of thing, okay? He says, your neck like a tower of ivory. And this reference to the ivory thing is probably more a reference to the lightness of the skin than it is to anything else. If you remember that one of the lines that appeared in the very first chapter of this is, I am black but beautiful. And the idea is, if you're not a wealthy person, in the Mideast you work. And if you're working outside, most of your body is uncovered, okay? So your neck will be dark, your hands will be dark, this sort of thing. Your arms are dark, that sort of thing. And almost the sign of beauty is the lighter your skin. But it basically was a sign of wealth, the lighter your skin. It's amazing to me how often in societies that the paleness of the skin of women was very, very important, because they always talk about men as being tall, dark, and handsome, you know, but with women it was the paleness, and so I'm not sure where that came from, but that's where the Tower of Ivory. And your eyes like the pools of Heshbon, and Heshbon was just a city, but the city was one of the ancient cities where they had a lot of water. They had fountains and these pools in the town there. He says, by the gate of Bath Rabbin, your nose like a tower of Lebanon. I don't think that's a good analogy either. But I think you know, in the Jews, the prominent nose is actually a thing of beauty, okay? A sentinel facing Damascus. Your head is held high as Carmel. Your hair is as dark as purple. A king is held captive in your tresses. And this head held high as Carmel. Another thing that's very, I don't know what, very powerful in the attractiveness of a person to another person is self-confidence. Like one of the things that I noticed when I was in Hawaii, that it is, it's probably what they eat as well as the way they eat. But Hawaiians, you know, they eat a lot of fish, but they eat a huge amount of taro. And taro is a plant that is basically carbs, pure carbs. And the Hawaiian women become enormous. They're very large. But it's interesting, they appear beautiful. And they're always very proud of their size and this sort of thing, and they carry it just very well. And this idea of somehow being able to have pride in the way you look and this sort of thing. So, and your hair as dark as purple. They remember their hair is black, but the one thing they used to put a lot of in their hair was henna. And so henna causes it to get kind of reddish, and the reddish on the black, you get kind of a dark purple look to it. And a king is captured by the beauty. How beautiful you are, how charming, my love, my delight, okay? And I'd like you to notice the two words, love and delight, because love has to do with the way he looks at her. Delight has to do with the way she looks at him, okay? So that he says, how beautiful you are, how charming, my love, my delight, in stature like a palm tree. And the palm tree, one of the things that's interesting, well, you'd probably notice it in the weather now, but like on the island of Kauai, where I was, we used to have tsunamis, and we used to have really serious winds. And you know, a palm tree can be blown flat to the ground and get up when it's over. They are not pulled up by the thing. And so this idea of having the stature of the palm tree, that you hold this thing, and its fruit in clusters, your breasts. they're comparing the clusters of dates that would be on the palm tree to the breast. When you think of palm trees in the Mideast, incidentally, don't think of coconut palms. Think of date palms, okay? He said, I have decided I shall climb the palm tree. I shall seize its cluster of dates. So he wants the sexual relationship with her. May your breasts be clusters of grapes, your breath as sweet as scented apples, and your palate like sweet wine, flowing down the throat of my love as it runs on the lips and teeth. Okay? So this is just a specific way in which he desires the sexual union. Now she responds this way again. She says, I belong to my love, and his desire is for me. And in the love relationship, each person is enslaved to the other by choice. Okay? So it's, I belong to him, but it's because his desire is for me. It's just, you know, a mutual surrender. That's one of the things that I studied a lot of things about different aspects of sexuality when I was going through school, particularly in the area of psychology. But I've always wondered what it is that any person can possibly get out of rape. Because the whole thing of sexual is this mutual surrender. And that isn't a part of it at all, you know, and yet, anyway. He says, come, my love, let us go to the fields. We will spend the night in the villages, and the early morning we will go to the vineyards. Now they mentioned going to the fields and going to the vineyards, but remember they talked about this as the beginning of spring? Well, in the beginning of spring, the sexual rites, even in the pagan thing, took place all outdoors. And they took place outdoors because you could go into these orchards. I don't know if you've ever been through an apple orchard or a cherry orchard when they're in bloom. The scent is intoxicating. And so that's what they would do. They would go out these areas. And it isn't as though it was out in public. I mean, these were all big areas you could go into and get lost in. So he says we could spend the night in the villages, but then we go into the vineyards or into the fields. We will see if the vines are budding, if their blossoms are opening, if the pomegranate trees are in flower, okay? So the idea is, again, in the ancient world, that the rites that were connected to the sexual rites to Adonis and to Venus, the whole rites had to take place when the flowers had begun to bloom. In fact, in the city of Rome, this may be all through Italy, I don't know. The city of Rome, people used to plant a planter of some kind in front of their house with crocus, and you could participate in the pagan rites of Adonis and Venus and stuff when your crocus bloomed. That was God's invitation of you into the sexual rites in the pagan religions, okay? So they saw this. He says, then I shall give you the gift of my love, okay? So they see the sexual union as that. The mandrakes yield their fragrance. The most exquisite fruits are at our doors. New things, as well as the old, I have stored up for you, my love. It's the idea that when they come into this relationship, there is, you know, what they've known of one another and what they're going to find out about one another. There's this ongoing growth in the relationship. New things and old as well, I have stored up. And I think you notice this in a lot more in younger people who are not married, who fall in love. And one of the reasons is married people oftentimes spend so much of their life together that they don't actually have a lot to bring to talk about in the thing. Whereas you watch two a boy and a girl, let's say, in college, particularly boys and girls who are like in a separate college and stuff, when they come together, neither one can stop talking. And it's because they're catching up on all this stuff. And this idea, I'm saving it up for you. Now remember the very first thing I told you in the beginning, that she is in the harem in this, and he's trying to sneak her out. And he's behind one of these elaborate windows so they cannot see him. But he can talk, because no one can identify him. He can see her, but she cannot speak. Because as soon as she gives herself away, then she would be executed or whatever, you know, for this sort of thing. So there's this effort. They have to meet and get somewhere. And now this is going on. Why are you not my brother, nursed at my brother's breast? Then, if I met you out of doors, I could kiss you without people thinking ill of me. Okay? So she's saying if we had a closer relationship or this sort of thing, then we could celebrate our relationship in public, you know, and could be seen and this sort of thing. But the last thing she really wants is that he should be her brother. She said, I should lead you and take you into my father's house, and you would teach me. So she said, I could with great freedom meet you on the street and take you into my own home, and then you could teach me about the love business, okay? He said, I could do that if we were in this closer relationship. She said, I should give you spiced wine to drink, juice of my pomegranates. And the interesting thing here is that when he's talking about the spiced wine, or when she's talking about giving the spiced wine, the idea here is that spiced wine was part of the formal rites of sexual rites in the pagan religions, and the juice of my pomegranates is a sexual reference, okay? But they're carried together. She says, his left arm is under my head, and his right arm embraces me. So she speaks of this union as though it has already taken place, but in the poem, it hasn't, okay? Now he speaks to this chorus of women, remember, called the Daughters of Jerusalem, and he says, I charge you, daughters of Jerusalem, do not rouse, do not awaken my beloved before she pleases. Now, I told you that one of the things that is going on in this, and the way this is interpreted by the rabbis, is that this is the relationship between Israel and God, okay? That, you know, once this was in the scriptures, they had to figure out a way to think. Now, in Catholic tradition, we would follow that, a relationship between God and the church. But more significantly, in spirituality, it's seen as the relationship between God and the individual. And so that in this relationship between God and the individual, that we come to understand our worth through the way God looks at us and seeing God look at us that way, whether we get it through other people or whatever, that this sense of how God feels about us. And because of the infinity of God, God can react to each one of us as though we were the only person who ever lived or ever would live. He can actually do that. Like our energies are divided. Like you'd notice, one of the things to notice in the scriptures is that when Jesus first begins teaching, he has 72 people who gather around him. He immediately will cut it down to 12. And the thing is, Jesus has to have a certain kind of relationship with the 12 apostles in order for them to imbibe the faith. And as a human being, I can only deal with so many people at a time, okay? And so that's not true of God, but that's one of the things that you and I have trouble getting over with. Because like when I would kneel down to pray about something, I would have to think in my mind, I'm not the most important thing he has to do today. And, you know, I know what's going on. But in fact, in the relationship between God and I am the only thing he has to do today. He can deal with each of us exactly that way. It's because of the infinity of God. And to come to understand this, then you go on this. But this idea that the relationship between me and God, in that relationship, God is the male, okay, in that relationship. And that's why it's, I charge you, daughters of Jerusalem, do not arouse, do not awaken my beloved before she pleases. The thing is, this relationship between God and the individual waits on God, okay? So that God reacts to us in different ways and develops us towards the relationship. And like one of the things that went on, this is called in mystical theology, it's called the dark night of the soul. That when a person begins in a relationship with God, there's a lot of emotional and good effects of it. That you see wonderful visions when you pray, and I mean, it's just a very, very powerful thing. But over a period of time, that disappears. And that is called in the theology the dark night of the soul. And the dark night of the soul, there are no physical or natural benefits to prayer or the involvement of God. And God does that specifically to a person to wean them away from the effects of it to their, so it's the love of God rather than the love of the effects, okay? And so that it comes to that kind. Now, once that's accomplished, then all those effects can return, and it goes on that way. But for some people, like with Mother Teresa, it never ended. The end of her life, it was very, very difficult because she was in this dark night of the soul. She knew enough about theology to know what it was, but you all have the feeling God's never listening to you and you're abandoned and this sort of thing. But that really, if you know the theory and theology, that's why people used to have spiritual directors. A spiritual director has studied this sort of stuff, and you'd say, no, I don't get anything out of prayer anymore. That's not necessarily bad, okay? Although we encourage people, if you're getting nothing out of prayer, you should change the way you're praying. There are a lot of different ways. But if you're into the dark night of the soul, none of the ways is going to provide what you wanted. But at least you try a bunch of different ways. So he says, don't awaken my beloved before she pleases. So he's saying that this love should not be, forced on. You have to wait the time. I don't know about other people, but the older I get, the thinner pages get. So it continues with, actually, it's the conclusion. It said, who is this coming up from the desert, leaning on her lover? Okay, so he's speaking now. He says, who's this coming up from the desert, leaning on her lover? Now, what has happened is they've gotten away. Okay, so the two of them. So now someone's looking. He says, I awakened you under the apple tree where your mother conceived you, where she who bore you conceived you. So they're in the what do you want to call it, the orchard, the apple orchard at the time of the blooming and everything, but it's the same place where her mother conceived her, that they're there. He says, set me like a seal on your heart, like a seal on your arm. And if you look in the book of Revelation, you'll notice that when people are called by God, it says they are marked with the seal of the living God. And you remember the damned have the mark of the beast, okay? I'd like you to notice the difference between a seal and a mark. So if we take a seal and we put it in the wax conforms to the seal. A mark can be anything. Okay? So what happens is, in this relationship with God, we ask him to set us as a seal so that in the relationship, I conform to God. Okay, not just that I have a check put on my forehead or something like that, but it's very interesting. In the book of Revelation, what God does is seals people, but what Satan does is marks people. And a mark and a seal sound like the same thing, but they aren't at all. So he says, for love is as strong as death, and jealousy as fierce as Sheol. And Sheol is the land of the deceased. It isn't a hell or heaven thing or anything that they would just, Sheol is where whatever remains of us goes ultimately, okay, everlasting life or just cease to exist. And he says, its flame is a flame of fire, a mighty flame. Okay, so he says that love is a flame. And again, it's very interesting that love is almost uncontrollable, and it becomes a true and honest obsession. And if you study in psychology, there's a difference between an obsession and a possession. And an example of a possession is like if a demon takes you over. But if a demon takes you over, you have no power over it at all. And that's why in the scriptures, no person who's possessed ever asks to have the demon driven out, because the demon's in charge. The demon's not going to ask that. But an obsession is almost as strong as a possession. An example of an obsession would be smoking for some people. Another example of an obsession is alcoholism. Now, you could say any smoker could stop smoking anytime they wanted, which would be an indication you have never smoked. Okay? Or you could say an alcoholic could stop anytime they wanted, which indicates you've never been addicted to alcohol. But the fact of the matter is, an obsession is very hard to break, but it is breakable. An obsession can be broken. Okay? So he says, no flood can quench love, no torrents drowned it. It should be in San Luis for a day. But it's the idea that the flame can't be put out. Were a man to offer all his family wealth to buy love, contempt is all he would gain. And the fact is, you can't buy love, you can't purchase love, you can't trick people. It's really interesting in watching people. You know, one of the real privileges of being in a seminary is that the seminary that I was in was on the campus of the University of San Diego. So while we were on the campus and studying the things, that is the age at which people are all involved in these really strong relationships, which we were not because of the seminary business. But it was really interesting to watch that, you know, like this guy would really fall for this girl, and they'd go together for a while, and she might decide he's not the one for whatever reason. They kind of separate, and the plans he would go through to reacquire her, and plans of finding a way to turn her against anyone else or prevent people, and all this. And it's crazy. It's crazy because if you end up with a prisoner, you don't have love. You could oblige the person, but that's not love. It is a mutual surrender. Okay, and if it's not a mutual surrender, it isn't there. And it says, our sister is little. Her breasts are not yet formed. What shall we do for our sister on the day she is betrothed? Okay, so this girl is really young, and so she's going to be betrothed. And I mentioned to you before, in the ancient world, you could be betrothed before you were born. So that like this family and this family wanted their property united. So one of my children, let's say I have a daughter is born, and she would be betrothed to the first male born in your family, or the reverse, you know. So the betrothals went on that way. And that could well be where Joseph and Mary were betrothed too. It could well be the thing that took place that way. And so If she is a rampart on the crest, we shall build a battlement of silver. Okay? So if she's a rampart on the battlement, we build a battlement of silver. What's the battlement of silver? Understand that you don't use silver or gold to defend something. A battlement of silver is a shield of ownership. Okay? This is so-and-so's castle. Okay? So on the battlement, we mark her. If she's a door, we'll enclose her with planks of cedar. Okay? So whatever she is, we will mark her out and decorate her. Okay? And this idea that she's betrothed, so they're going to mark her out and decorate her, you realize that's in contrast with the fact that ultimately the person falls in love or they don't fall in love. You know, it does. You could argue, like if a person's in love, you could argue for hours about how more beautiful another person is. And you could objectively be able to prove that that person's so much more beautiful. But that doesn't affect the love thing. Not at all, okay? I probably have told you one of the experiences I had in high school. I was at an all-boys Catholic high school, and we were surrounded by 4 all-girls Catholic high schools. There's a really good God in charge. But anyway, so we had this set up. But anyway, one of the girls was just an amazing beauty at one of the schools. And I managed to get a date with her once for one of the dances. So I took her to the dance, everything my dad was asking me about later. And it was kind of a disappointing experience. And I remember talking to my dad about it, and he was saying, I wish I could remember the whole conversation. It was very good. But he said, well, why did you invite her? I said, well, she's the most beautiful girl around. I like the idea of that I had brought the most beautiful girl. And he says, was she the most beautiful girl? I said, yes. He said, if you wanted a conversationalist, you should have picked someone you like to talk to. But you know, this whole idea that doesn't make it, you know, that the beauty is not the thing. Being a conversationalist is not the thing. There is something magical about it, and whatever it is. Anyway, he says, I am a wall, and my breasts are its towers, and under his eyes I have found peace. Now, obviously, it's her who has spoken here, okay? So it's under his eyes I've found peace. And again, the idea of somehow being able to find peace under the gaze of God. Solomon had a vineyard at Baal Hamon, and he entrusted it to overseers. Each was to pay him the value of its produce, 1,000 shekels of silver. But I tend my own vineyard myself. You, Solomon, may have your 1,000 shekels, and those who tend its produce, their 200. And what he's saying is, Solomon has all this money and all this thing. He picks all these wives, all this stuff. He says, you can have all of that. He says, I have the one I'm in love with. And that's the thing. And he says, you who dwell in the gardens, my companions, listen for your voice. Let me hear it. Hasten away, my love, like a gazelle, a young stag on the mountains of spice. And again, remember, this last is her. Hasten away, my love, like a gazelle, a young stag on the mountains of spice. And incidentally, in the temples, the pagan temples, this mountain of spice, they made like beds of spice where the sexual things took place in the pagan temples. Okay, so that's the book. And remember, the thing talks about the uniqueness of the relationship. To remember the relationship is at the hands of God. I'm supposed to be available, but it is at the hands of God. And the development is all kinds of things take place in your life that you are supposed to cull the information out of in order to come to a better understanding of God. And so that, like for instance, if you're the type of person who finds walking on the beach an amazing experience of peace and this sort of thing, You need to know that that peace is available in God. There he's used the beach to teach you of God, and he'll use people to teach you of him. But it's supposed to, everything comes together in this ultimate relationship with God. And this is, in our tradition, what life is about is this journey towards this love relationship with God, to celebrate it. First, I'll take a few minutes and see if we have any questions. Anyone have any questions?